Okay, so what we wanted to do is look at some classic problems that have been studied in the reasoning literature, but take a more developmental perspective on them and see what we could figure out. So I just want to start by priming some intuitions with a famous problem from this literature. So this is from work by Kahneman and Tversky. If you're not familiar with it, just think about how you would respond here. So in this task, participants are told some information about Linda. They're told that she's 31 years old, she's single, outspoken, and very bright. In college, she majored in philosophy, and as a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and she also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So after given this information about Linda, participants are asked which is more probable. Is it more probable that Linda is a bank teller, or is it more probable that Linda is a bank teller who is also active in the feminist movement? And I don't know about you, but to me, the second answer sort of calls out as the right one. There's something inside of me that's jumping up and down saying that's the right answer. But what was noticed by Kahneman and Tversky is that if you think about this from a boring probability theoretic perspective, that's actually the wrong answer. So it should actually be more probable that Linda is merely a bank teller. And this is because if you think about being a bank teller and being active in the feminist movement as properties, it should always be true that having two properties is less probable, less likely than having one property. So another way of putting it, there's more bank tellers in the world than there are feminist bank tellers. But as soon as you put this in terms of a reasoning failure where you sort of fail to grasp these probability theoretic notions, it sort of jumps out, at least to me, that there's something wrong about that. And in particular, there is something about the type of information, the way this problem was framed, that suggests to you that the second answer is right. So why are you telling me so much about her political background if she isn't active in the feminist movement? And why are you giving me these two options? They seem contradictory. So given what you've told me, I'd prefer to think that she's active in the feminist movement. And so I think for a certain amount of people in the literature, this is pretty well established that the framing of the problems you have is going to interact with the kinds of inferences that humans make. But what we're really interested in asking is, where is most of the action in this interaction? So this maybe is a little bit too subtle so far, but is most of the action coming from the properties of the human mind and the reasoning capacities that humans have? Or is more of the action coming from the properties of the stimulus itself and the way humans interpret that stimulus? So to make this a little bit more concrete, if this works, you might have two different explanations here. You can have a set of reasoning-based accounts that say, if you think that human reasoning mechanisms are classical reasoning from your logic textbook, these are failures. So these are demonstrating the limits of whatever sort of general purpose reasoning mechanism we have. Those can fail in edge cases. Of course, you can have a reasoning-based account where you don't think that humans are doing classical reasoning. They might be doing something like confirmation theoretic hypothesis testing, and then you wouldn't think of these as failures. In contrast to those reasoning-based accounts, you could also have interpretation-based accounts that would say these aren't failures of classical reasoning. Instead, they're demonstrating properties of the human interpretive system. So there's some sort of interpretation of these premises that are going on that in effect means there's a sort of hidden premise that we didn't intend as experimentalists. And as soon as you place that hidden premise into the problem, classical reasoning just follows to give you that result. So what we wanted to do is distinguish these by examining them from a developmental perspective. And the reason we think we can do this is arguably the reasoning-based accounts are saying something about what it means to be human, and so they should leave less room for developmental changes. Whereas interpretation-based accounts are saying something about how you understand certain linguistic representations. And so, of course, we know that that changes over the course of development. You should have more room for developmental changes from those types of accounts. And so the test case we wanted to use is not this famous Linda example, but instead we wanted to look at illusory inferences from disjunction. And the reason we thought that would be interesting is because this is a type of reasoning failure that is well replicated on the adult side, but we know absolutely nothing about how children respond in these cases, although we do know a ton about the way children treat disjunction and the kinds of linguistic interpretations that they have over development. So just to spoil the ending, what I'm going to show you is that children do not make the same inferences as adults. So in this case, they don't make these reasoning failures. And they also don't interpret disjunction the same way that adults do. And for us, this provides initial support for interpretation-based accounts over reasoning-based ones. Okay, so here is the original case of illusory inferences from disjunction that was tested by Johnson, Laird, and colleagues. So they gave subjects these two premises. First, you were told either Jane is kneeling by the fire and she is looking at the TV, or otherwise Mark is standing at the window and he is peering into the garden. And then you were told that Jane is kneeling by the fire, and you were asked, does it follow that she's also looking at the TV? And so in many different cases with slightly different aspects to these premises, we find that adults accept that this follows in 80% of cases. So they really want to conclude that Jane is looking at the TV when they have these two premises. The problem with this, and why you might think it's a reasoning failure, is that you can consider the case where Mark is standing at the window and he's peering into the garden and Jane is kneeling by the fire, but it's not the case that she's looking at the TV. So this possibility is consistent with both of the two premises, but you don't have the same conclusion in this case. Okay, so these examples are a little bit clunky and hard to deal with, so I just want to sort of create some structure in them so we can see what's going on with this. So the idea here is that premise 1 has this disjunction. You have A and B, or C and D. Premise 2 tells you A. There's partial overlap with the first disjunctive premise 1. And you're asked whether it follows that B. This is a very attractive conclusion or inference for people to make, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, because you have cases where you satisfy the second disjunctive premise 1. You also satisfy premise 2, but it doesn't follow that B. Okay. So just to abstract away from the nature of the example with peering into the garden, what we have here is this disjunctive first premise and a second premise that has partial overlap with the first disjunct. People want to conclude that it follows that B. And on a flat or truth conditional representation of those premises, it really doesn't follow that B. That's what I showed you with the A and C and D, but not B case. But if you think about having a structured representation of these premises, the way I've highlighted them here, then it does seem to follow that if you think of A and B as sort of separate and distinct from C and D, then telling me A does make me conclude that B. Okay. So what we want to think about is how the reasoning-based accounts would say that you induce structure in this premise 1, and how the interpretation-based accounts would do this. So the reasoning-based accounts, in particular one developed by my co-author Salvador Mascarenas, says that uncertainty is going to draw our attention and we want to resolve it as soon as possible. So premise 1 raises these two possibilities. It gives us some uncertainty and we want to know which one is actual. Premise 2 is taken to provide a resolution to this, so it sort of answers the question that we have under discussion. And the thought is that children will have the same question answering motivations as adults, so you shouldn't see much developmental difference here. In contrast, interpretation-based accounts would say that when we encounter weak language, we want to enrich it so that it means more, so that we can get something more out of it. And premise 1 has a very weak meaning on its literal interpretation, so we want to enrich it to have a stronger, almost super exclusive meaning, something where all of the red things are true and none of the green things, or vice versa. And the thought here is that children, on these interpretation-based accounts, children might respond quite differently from adults because they have different sets of enrichments throughout the course of development from adults. So I don't have time to go into this, but you can ask me about it in the question session if you're interested. We know from previous research in developmental linguistics that adults will accept disjunctive statements like 1 in cases where only one of the disjuncts is true. This is the sort of exclusive interpretation. But children will actually prefer to accept these disjunctive statements where both disjuncts are true. So they seem to have conjunctive responses to disjunction. Okay, so we wanted to test these hypotheses in our study, and what we did is we took these traditional illusory inference from disjunction tasks that I've shown you, and we modified them to be more appropriate for children. So in particular, I showed you this previously, the judgment task where you're given two premises, you're asked to say what follows. We wanted to do something a little bit more intuitive for kids. So instead we gave them this preference-based task where they were asked which one of two pictures was more compatible with the premises that they had. We also syntactically simplified the sentences so they weren't as clunky as these John and Mary examples I've showed you. and we presented the premises auditorily so that children didn't have to read them. So the context here was that Mrs. Nice had given an assignment to her students. They were asked to color certain things in their coloring book. She graded the assignments and all of the students did quite well, but then they got jumbled up for some reason. And so we need to help her decide which one of these worksheets goes with which student and which assignment. So this is an example from our familiarization. If the assignment was for the student to color 2 circles, we were asking participants to say which one of these worksheets was more compatible. And so here the one on the left would be more compatible because that's the only one where 2 circles were colored in. And this was done with French-speaking 5-year-olds, but I'm going to show you all of the stimuli in English just for ease of presentation. Ask me about the French if you're interested. And so we manipulated 2 factors. We also had tons of filler items that I don't have time to tell you about. But in particular, we were interested in the types of sentences that you had for your premises and also the types of images that you got to choose between. So the sentence types that we had were this disjunction. She colored in every circle or 3 squares. And the idea here is that without individually mentioning the propositions A, B, C, and D, I'm sort of creating the same structure here because every circle is sort of going to token all of the individual circles and 3 squares is going to separately sort of represent 3 squares. But we still have the same structure when you consider our second premise because some circles has partial overlap with the disjunct every circle. So in the illusory inferences context, we tested both of these sentences, and we also tested situations where you only had the disjunctive premise so that we would know something about children's interpretations of disjunction here. And then we tested 2 types of image comparison. So the one on the top is our one both comparison, and we called them that because one of the images makes true only one disjunct every circle. The both image makes true both of the disjuncts. And then we also had the one mixed comparison. So here again, the one image makes true only one of the disjuncts, but the mixed image has a mixture of the 2 shapes. And this one mixed comparison is what's important for our illusory inferences from disjunction, because if you have a flat understanding of the 2 premises, both of these images should be compatible with your understanding. So both images make true one of the disjuncts in premise 1. And it's also true that in both images you have some circles. So it would only be if you have this structured representation of the premises, as I've highlighted here, that would enable you to choose between one or the other of them. Okay, so the predictions that we had based on our previous hypotheses, that would be reasoning-based accounts would say that children make illusory inferences just like adults do. So if you have a setup where you're given both of these premises and you're asked to choose between the one image and the mixed image, if you make the illusory inference, you're going to pick the one image. Whereas interpretation-based accounts would say children don't make illusory inferences. In fact, they should pick the opposite in these cases. So with the 2 premises and the one mixed option, they should be picking the mixed image, which is the one on the right in that second pair. And the interpretation-based account makes this prediction because it says that children are actually going to have conjunctive responses to disjunction. So if you're given only the disjunction, she colored in every circle or 3 squares, you should prefer the image on the right because that is the one that makes both disjuncts true. Okay. So here's what we found. First, I'll look at our results on the types of illusory inferences that children made, whether or not they made them. So to remind you, this is the case where we tested both of the premises, and we had the one mixed image choice. And here the target image would be the one on the left. This is the one compatible with illusory inference. So that's what we have graphed on the y-axis, is how often children make that choice. What you see is that as a group, children are only choosing that image about half of the time. Of course, different children have different strategies, but it seems like as a group, the children have no preference here. And as for children's responses to disjunction only, in this case, we tested only the first premise and we gave you a different image comparison. So the one disjunct image versus the both disjuncts image. And here the adults would choose the one on the left, so that's what we have graphed on the y-axis, how often you make the adult-like choice. Oops, I've gone backwards. Okay, so what you see here is that, in fact, children very rarely pick the adult-like choice. More often than not, they are picking the image that makes both of the disjuncts true, which is a replication of previous research in this area. Okay, so to revisit our predictions very quickly, the reasoning-based account would say, because you don't have much room for developmental differences here, children should make illusory inferences. That prediction was not borne out. Children didn't prefer the image on the left in this pair. In fact, they preferred neither of the images. In contrast, interpretation-based accounts say that children shouldn't make illusory inferences because they should have conjunctive responses to disjunction. This first prediction was partially borne out. So of course, children didn't make illusory inferences because they didn't prefer the image on the left, but they had no preference here. So depending on how you think about it, that prediction was borne out, wasn't. But we did find that they did make conjunctive responses to disjunction. So to sum up, in our task, children do not make illusory inferences from disjunction. In fact, they have absolutely no preference in this context where adults make illusory inferences from disjunction. We also found that kids have conjunctive responses to disjunction. So for us, this suggests that children do not fall victim to the same reasoning failures as adults because they have a different interpretation of the premises involved. But to look at the more broad picture, sort of abstracting away from the aspects of this task, because this is just sort of an initial first step with preliminary findings, we want to think about how much we are going to achieve if we think about these so-called reasoning failures, not as failures, but as logical responses to a structured understanding of the premises involved. So we've provided initial support for one way of inducing structure and representations through interpretive mechanisms. But in the future, I want to draw your attention to particularly these last two bullets. What we want to do is we want to ask what other cues can induce these kinds of structured representations. We've touched on the first bullet point in this study, so it seems like linguistic representations might do that for adults, but is it possible that communicative cues, which don't involve linguistic representations, could do that, or that intentional but non-communicative cues, or in fact that sort of accidental things that merely draw your attention to the difference between these things might create the structured representation? So we have plans to ask for these four different things, whether they induce structure for infants, older children, and adults. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We have time for a few questions. Colleen?
Hi. Could you go back to the results slide just for a moment?
Which part of the results?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I just need it up there to refer to because I found this all extremely confusing.
Yes, sorry.
And I'm wondering if I don't even know what I would do, A. But also, B, if I'm a child, I'm not necessarily I'm wondering if what the children did instead in this task is something like this. Certainly in the bottom, the conjunctive responses to disjunction, is they may have said, okay, there's two clauses in this sentence, every circle and 3 squares. I should choose something that has 2 lines to it. And in the middle case there, she colored in every circle and 3 squares. Sometimes they weighted the every, and then sometimes they weighted the fact that there were 2 clauses, 2 relevant clauses. So I'm just wondering if there's anything in your data that can speak against this much lower level explanation.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's right. And what's interesting about that is we were looking at this from the perspective of whether or not you have scalar implicatures, so either scalar implicatures with the disjunction or even scalar implicatures with the sum item. But you can also have different kinds of implicatures that would go along the type of reasoning that you're talking about. So you can have relevance implicatures. Why would you have mentioned the thing unless it should be in the image? So here that would sort of make sense of if you have a disjunct, you should pick the image that has parts of both of the disjuncts. So I sort of agree with that intuition, and I don't think that there's very much in our data that goes against it. But I also think just having this intuition also sort of drives home our point a little bit, because if you have to resort to one of these strategies, it sort of implies that you actually aren't pulled in one direction or the other, whereas adults would be sort of instantly pulled in one of these 2 directions. So just having to resort to something like this to pick between the images suggests that you're not getting these illusory inferences, which for adults seem to be very strong if they're picking the thing 80% of the time.
Okay, so you wouldn't consider it a low-level explanation. You would consider it the mechanism or maybe the definition of this, and I'm just not in the logic world.
No. So I do think that's why I sort of tried to say at the end that I think these are initial preliminary things, and why I think we're moving towards what we're doing more in the future is going to be a little bit more informative, because you're right, like, these are very hard stimuli. It's, you know, it's not clear in some of the cases what you should do. So I sort of am agreeing with your intuition, but saying, like, maybe that there's a little bit more to what we're saying than the intuition suggests. Yeah.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, Rachel. I was getting some signals that we have to stop here, unfortunately. Thank you very much again, and thanks all of you. It was a very nice session.